I caught my son-in-law standing over my wife's wheelchair, working a screwdriver into the brake mechanism while the rehearsal dinner crowd laughed 20 feet away, and my own daughter was standing right next to him, holding a napkin up to block anyone's view. I did not yell. I did not cause a scene. I handled it the way a man who spent 38 years as a master electrician handles a live wire that's been mislabeled as dead. I stepped back into the dark, and I watched. Hours later, when my wife rolled herself down the ramp toward the head table in front of 200 guests, the wheel locked, the frame buckled, and the chair pitched forward exactly the way it was built to. But to understand how my daughter's engagement party turned into the worst night of her fiancé's life, you need to know what happened 1 hour before the caterers even opened the doors. My name is Walter Hensley. I'm 66 years old, and I spent nearly 4 decades wiring commercial buildings before I retired and handed the company to men half my age. I know the difference between a frayed wire and a fresh cut. I know what sabotage looks like, because I've spent my whole career walking into buildings after something's gone wrong and figuring out whether it was an accident or a decision. That night, in the ballroom of the Whitmore Hotel, I found out it was a decision. It was a Friday evening, 6 weeks before my daughter Renee's wedding, and we were hosting the engagement party, the Meet the Family event her fiancé's parents had insisted on, the kind of overproduced affair where everybody smiles too hard and nobody says what they're really thinking. I'd paid for half of it myself, $12,000, because Renee wanted it perfect, and after everything my wife Diane had been through, I wanted her to have one night where she didn't have to worry about a single thing. Diane had a spinal injury 11 months earlier, a fall down our back porch steps that shattered 2 vertebrae and left her with partial paralysis in her legs. She could stand for short stretches with a walker, but for anything longer, she needed her wheelchair, a good one, custom-fitted, that we'd spent almost $9,000 getting right after her insurance dragged its feet for months. She hated needing it. She was proud, the kind of woman who ran a flower shop for 30 years on her feet 12 hours a day, and having to be pushed into a room instead of walking into it on her own. 2 legs had broken something in her that the accident itself hadn't managed to touch. I'd arrived early that evening to check on the audio setup, because Renee had asked me to make sure the microphones were working before the toasts started. The ballroom was empty except for the catering staff finishing the centerpieces, and I walked in through the side entrance near the coat check, the same way I always did at these venues, out of habit more than anything. That's when I heard voices near the head table, low and careful in the way people talk when they think no one's listening. It was Renee's fiancé, Preston, and standing beside him, holding a folded napkin like she was trying to shield something from view, was my daughter. Preston was crouched down at the side of Diane's wheelchair, not her everyday chair, but the newer one we'd had shipped in special for the event, chrome finished, the one Diane had been so excited to use because it finally looked like something she'd have picked out herself, instead of something medical. He had a small screwdriver in his hand, and he was working it into the housing where the wheel lock mechanism sat. I stopped in the shadow of the drapery, the same way I used to stop in a half-built stairwell when I heard something that didn't sound right. Preston muttered something, and my Renee leaned down and said, "Just make sure it happens during the toast, not before. I want everyone watching." For a second, I told myself I'd misheard her. I told myself that the man who raised her, who taught her to ride a bike in the church parking lot and sat through 11 years of dance recitals, could not possibly be listening to his only daughter plan an accident for her own mother. Then Preston straightened up, wiped his hands on his slacks, and said, "It'll look completely natural. Wheelchair frame gives out. Everyone rushes to help. And in the chaos, nobody's going to be looking at the guest list when your dad has to explain why he spent Renee's whole trust fund fixing up a woman who can't even walk down the aisle at her own daughter's wedding." I stepped out from behind the drapery. "What exactly is going on here?" I asked, and my voice came out flatter and colder than I expected it to. Renee's face went white. Preston, to his credit or maybe to his shame, didn't flinch nearly as much. He straightened his jacket, put on the same easy, apologetic smile I'd watched him use on waiters and valets for 2 years, the one that had always made the back of my neck itch even when I couldn't say why. "Walter," he said, like we were old friends catching up, "you scared us. We were just checking the chair." Renee noticed one of the wheels was squeaking earlier and didn't want it embarrassing her mom in front of everyone. "I used to fix bikes in high school. Figured I'd take a look." It was a good lie. It had the right shape to it, caring, practical, deniable. If I'd been a man who spent his life behind a desk, maybe I'd have believed it, thanked him, and gone back to checking the microphones. But I'd spent 38 years learning to read the difference between what a wire is supposed to do and what somebody wants it to do. And I looked down at that housing and saw exactly what he'd done. He hadn't tightened anything. He'd shaved down the pin that kept the wheel lock engaged, just enough that it would hold under light pressure and give out completely the moment real weight came down on it. The kind of weight a woman puts on a wheel lock when she's using it to steady herself while she leans forward, hugs someone, or to reach for a microphone. I looked at my daughter. She wouldn't meet my eyes. She was staring at the napkin still folded in her hands like it might tell her what to say next. The urge to grab Preston by his expensive collar and throw him through the ballroom doors was close to overwhelming. But something colder took over. The same instinct that had kept me from screaming at a contractor on a job site when I found a gas line capped with electrical tape instead of a proper fitting. If I exploded right there, they'd deny everything, cry about being misunderstood, and I'd be the unhinged father who ruined his daughter's engagement party over a squeaky wheel. I needed them to believe they'd gotten away with it. I needed to know exactly how far they were willing to let this go, and I needed proof that would hold up to more than my word against theirs. So I did something that cost me more than anything I'd ever built or wired in my life. I smiled back. "Well, I appreciate you looking out for her," I said, forcing my voice into something warm and grateful. "She's been so nervous about tonight. It means a lot that you two thought of it." Preston's shoulders dropped with relief, and the smirk he'd been fighting to hide crept fully onto his face. Renee let out a breath like she'd been holding it since I walked in. "Of course, Walter," Preston said. "We just want tonight to go perfectly for her." "It will," I said, and I meant it, though not in the way he thought. I walked away toward the catering staff, my legs carrying me at a steady pace while my chest felt like it had a live current running straight through it. I found a quiet corner near the kitchen doors, took out my phone, and pulled up the security app for the ballroom, because I'd learned decades ago, doing walkthroughs on half-finished buildings at 2 in the morning, that if something feels wrong, you document it before you confront it. The Whitmore had cameras covering the head table for liability reasons, standard in a venue that size. I checked the footage in real time, watched Preston's hands work that screwdriver in clean, silent detail, watched Renee stand guard with that napkin. I saved it. I sent it to myself twice, once to my email, and once to a cloud folder Diane didn't know existed, the same folder where I'd once kept photographs of code violations before a lawsuit. Then I did what any man who's spent his life fixing things does when he finds something broken on purpose. I didn't throw it away. I fixed it my way. I found the venue's maintenance closet, the kind every hotel keeps stocked with the basics, and I located a replacement wheel lock housing, identical to the one on Diane's chair, sitting in a bin of spare hardware the Whitmore kept for their own house wheelchairs. I've replaced hundreds of mechanical housings in my life. It took me 11 minutes with tools I always carry in my truck out of habit. I swapped the sabotaged housing out entirely, restored the lock to full strength, and tested it 3 times myself, putting my own full weight on the footrest and yanking the frame the way a woman leaning hard for balance would. It held. It held perfectly. Then I took the housing Preston had tampered with, the one with the shaved pin, and I walked it over to a chair from the venue's own supply closet. A folding chair, the kind stacked along the back wall for overflow seating, the kind that gets pulled out and set at the end of a row when the guest list runs a few names over what the round tables can hold. I checked the seating chart Renee had emailed me the week before. Preston's parents had insisted on a specific arrangement family at the head table, close friends at the first 2 rounds, and then the overflow chairs along the side wall reserved for the wedding party's plus ones. One of those overflow chairs, according to the chart, belonged to Preston's best man, a loud, red-faced younger cousin of his named Chase, who'd already had 3 drinks by the time I walked back into the room. I picked a different overflow chair instead, the one closest to the small raised platform where the toasts would be given, the one Preston himself had specifically requested when he badgered the coordinator about wanting to be close to the mic for his speech. I fitted the sabotaged mechanism onto a folding chair's leg brace instead, using a length of aircraft cable and a locking pin the same way I'd once rigged temporary scaffolding on job sites that needed to hold weight for exactly one specific event and not a minute longer. It wasn't elegant. It didn't need to be. It needed to hold just long enough, then give out completely, the instant real pressure came down on it. The same instant, a groom-to-be leans his full weight against a chair, back to steady himself, while reaching for a microphone during a toast. I put the chair back exactly where the diagram said it should go. The room began to fill an hour later. Diane arrived on my arm, using her walker for the short distance from the car to her seat, moving carefully but proudly, wearing a dress the color of the delphiniums she used to grow behind our old flower shop. I settled her into her wheelchair at the head table myself, checking the wheel lock with my hand under the guise of adjusting her position, feeling it click solidly into place. She had no idea what I'd found an hour earlier. I hadn't told her. I couldn't tell her not yet. Not until I knew exactly how this would play out, because I needed her reaction, when it came, to be real in front of everyone who mattered. Guests filled the room. Preston's parents made their rounds, working the crowd with the easy confidence of people who'd never once had to wonder whether their child loved them for the right reasons. Renee sat beside Preston, laughing at something one of his groomsmen said, glancing occasionally toward her mother's wheelchair with an expression I couldn't quite read, not guilt, exactly, something closer to anticipation. Dinner came and went. I ate almost nothing. I watched Preston lean toward Chase at one point and murmur something, watched Chase glance toward Diane's chair and then quickly look away. And I understood then that Preston hadn't planned this alone, that at least one other person in that room knew what was supposed to happen during the toasts and was waiting for it the same way you wait for a firework you already know is coming. The coordinator tapped a fork against a champagne glass, and the room settled into the low hush that precedes toasts at every party of this kind. Preston's father went first. A warm, forgettable speech about welcoming Renee into the family. Then it was Preston's turn. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and made his way toward the small platform where the microphone stood, walking directly past the overflow chairs along the side wall. And, in the exact way I'd watched him do at 3 other events over the past 2 years, he reached out and braced his hand against the back of the nearest chair to steady himself as he stepped up onto the low platform. It was a habit, a tic, the kind of unconscious physical gesture a man repeats 100 times without ever noticing he's doing it, right up until the one time it matters. The chair gave out from under his hand instantly and completely. The leg brace folded sideways with a crack loud enough that half the room flinched, and Preston, already leaning his full weight into that unconscious brace, lurched forward with nothing to catch him. He didn't fall gracefully. He went down hard against the edge of the platform, his shoulder catching the corner of the dessert table on the way, sending a 3-tier engagement cake, sliding off its stand and onto the floor in a spray of buttercream and shattered fondant, and Preston landed flat on his back in the wreckage of it, his microphone skittering away across the marble floor with a piercing shriek of feedback that cut through the stunned silence of 200 guests. For a full 3 seconds, nobody moved. Then Chase, 3 drinks deep and unable to help himself, laughed a short, sharp bark of a laugh that he immediately tried to swallow back down when he realized the whole room could hear it, and heads turned toward him with confusion that would curdle, within the hour, into something much colder. Renee shot up out of her seat, and in her rush to get to Preston, she reached for her own chair to push it back the same easy, automatic motion any of us make 1,000 times a day, and I watched her hand come down on the armrest a half-second before I remembered, with a jolt, that I hadn't touched her chair. I'd never intended to. Her chair was fine. It was pure, uncomplicated panic that made her stumble, catching her heel in the hem of her dress as she scrambled toward her fiancé, and she went down onto one knee hard enough to tear the seam at her shoulder, letting out a cry that had nothing manufactured about it at all. The room exploded into motion, guests standing, someone calling for a doctor, Preston's mother shrieking his name, waiters rushing in from the kitchen. And in the middle of all of it, my wife Diane sat perfectly still in her wheelchair, hand pressed to her mouth, watching her daughter's fiancé writhe in wedding cake with a look of genuine, uncomprehending shock on her face because, unlike me, she still believed this was simply an accident. I did not move to help Preston up. I let 2 waiters and his own father do that. Instead, I walked calmly toward the small sound table where the coordinator kept the venue's house laptop, connected to the overhead screen, the one that had been playing a slideshow of Renee and Preston's photos on a loop. All evening, and I plugged in a small flash drive I'd prepared an hour earlier, right after I finished rigging that chair. The slideshow cut away from a photo of Renee and Preston at a lake house, and the ballroom's overhead screen filled instead with silent, high-definition security footage. Preston crouched at Diane's wheelchair with a screwdriver, Renee standing guard with a napkin, and audio I'd extracted and synced from my phone recording Renee's voice, clear as anything, saying, Just make sure it happens during the toast, not before. I want everyone watching. I let it play for 11 full seconds before I walked to the platform microphone myself, picked it up off the floor where it had skidded, and I did not raise my voice. I have never needed to raise my voice to be heard in a room. 38 years of foreman and job sites taught me that a calm voice in a silent room carries further than any shout ever could. I found this an hour ago, I said, rigging my wife's wheelchair to fail during her own daughter's toast tonight. I want everyone here to understand exactly what almost happened, and to whom, and why. I looked at Diane as I said it. I watched her face change the shock giving way, in slow and terrible stages, to a comprehension no parent should ever have to witness in real time, watching her own daughter's guilt confirmed on a 12-foot screen in front of 200 people. Renee did not deny it. She could not. The footage was already playing behind me, looping a second time, and Preston, still sitting in the wreckage of the cake with buttercream in his hair, had gone the color of old drywall. I want to tell you the room erupted into chaos, that people gasped and screamed and pointed, and some of that is true. But mostly, in my memory, it's quiet, the kind of thick, suffocating quiet that falls over a job site right after someone realizes just how close they came to something unrecoverable. Preston's mother was the first to speak, and what she said wasn't a defense of her son. It was a single broken, "Preston, what did you do?" And the way she said it told me she already knew the answer. I will spare you most of what happened over the following weeks, because the fallout, once it starts, tends to move on its own momentum, the way a structure comes down once you've pulled the one support beam holding the rest of the weight. Renee did not speak to me for 19 days. When she finally called, it wasn't to apologize. It was to ask, in a voice thin with something between fury and shame, how I could have set them up like that, as though the trap I'd built was somehow a greater betrayal than the one she'd built first. I told her the truth. I told her I hadn't set anyone up. I had simply refused to let her finish what she'd started, and instead let it land exactly where she'd aimed it. She hung up on me. It would be 4 more months before she called again, and when she did, it was a different call entirely, one that started with silence, and then with crying, and then, eventually, with the beginning of something like the truth. Because in the weeks after that party, once Preston understood there would be no quiet cover-up, no family closing ranks to protect appearances, his own carefully built life began to come apart at a pace that had nothing to do with me. It turned out, and I'd suspected something like this the moment I first laid eyes on him, the way you sometimes know a wall is load-bearing just from the sound it makes when you knock on it, that Preston had been running a private line of credit for 2 years under Renee's name, without her full understanding of the terms, using her modest trust fund as collateral for a series of bad real estate investments that had already gone underwater. The wheelchair scheme hadn't just been cruelty for its own sake. It had been strategy. He needed Diane discredited and humiliated, needed the story to become Walter's unstable, overspending family embarrasses itself at engagement party. Because he was 3 weeks away from needing Renee to co-sign a much larger loan, one her lawyer, once I finally convinced her to hire her own, separate from Preston's family attorney discovered, would have left her personally liable for debts north of $400,000. Renee broke off the engagement 11 days after that discovery. Preston's family, who had spent the engagement party publicly performing horror on his behalf, spent the weeks afterward quietly working to distance themselves from the wreckage of his finances, and within 4 months, Preston had moved out of state, and the lawsuits, because there were lawsuits, from at least 2 of the investors he'd misled, using forged documentation with his own father's signature, followed him there. As for Chase, the cousin whose laugh had been the first crack in the room's silence, he turned out to be the one piece of that night I never planned for and couldn't have predicted. He came to see me 3 weeks later, unprompted, sober this time, and told me he'd known about the wheelchair beforehand. Preston had bragged about it to him days earlier, calling it harmless, a joke that would put the old man in his place. And Chase had said nothing, done nothing, until he watched it actually happen in front of 200 people and heard my wife's name attached to it on a security screen. He said he couldn't sleep since. He gave a statement to Renee's lawyer without being asked. It didn't undo his silence, but I respected that he showed up to say so out loud, and I told him that. Diane's recovery, in the year that followed, surprised even her doctors. She'd spent the months before that party terrified of being seen as fragile, terrified of the wheelchair itself becoming the only thing people noticed about her, And something about watching the truth land exactly where it belonged that night seemed to loosen a knot in her that no physical therapist had managed to untie. She started standing longer, walking farther. 6 months later, at a much smaller, much quieter dinner Renee organized to formally apologize to her mother, Diane walked the length of the restaurant on her own 2 feet, cane in hand but chair left behind at home, and I watched my daughter cry in a way I hadn't seen since she was a little girl. Not performing grief for an audience this time, just quietly, privately devastated by what she'd almost let happen to the woman who raised her. Renee and I are rebuilding something now. It isn't finished. I don't know that it ever fully will be. You don't unlearn. As a father, the sound of your own daughter's voice asking someone to make sure an accident happens during the toast so that everyone will be watching. But she calls every Sunday now. She's back in school, finishing the degree she'd put on hold for a wedding that never happened. And last month she asked if she could take her mother dress shopping. Just the two of them, no occasion at all, just an afternoon. Diane and I still have our house, the one we raised Renee in, the one with the back porch steps that started all of this 11 months before any of it needed to become a lesson about who deserves your trust. We still take our evening walk most nights, her hand on my arm instead of a walker these days, moving slower than we used to but moving all the same. Past the flower beds she's started tending again for the first time since the accident. I think about that folding chair sometimes, the one I rigged with 11 minutes and a set of tools I've carried in my truck for 40 years. People ask me, when they hear this story, whether I feel guilty about what happened to Preston, about the cake, about the fall, about a man's whole engineered life coming apart on camera in front of everyone he was trying to impress. I don't. Not for a second. I didn't build that trap. I only refuse to let it be sprung on the one person in that room who never deserved it in the first place. If somebody in your life is quietly working on something they don't want you to see, pay attention to what they build. Pay attention to who they ask to stand guard while they do it. And if you ever find the wire already cut, waiting for someone to lean on it, don't just tape it back together and walk away pretending you didn't see. Sometimes the kindest, most protective thing a father can do is let the trap do exactly what it was built to do and simply make sure it finds the person who built it instead.